So I am very excited for this panel. We have Doug Lankler, who is a general counsel of PFIZER, a former federal prosecutor, so a criminal background. Michael Fricklas, do you know that we were at Sherman and Sterling together? Well, not together, but we both were there, so we do have a connection there. And Michael is currently the chief legal officer at Advance and was the general counsel at VIACOM, which is now Paramount, and is also on the American Bar Association AI committee, right?
Yes.
Helping to solve all these problems which are deeply impacting the legal profession. So our first panel framing will focus on what corporate leaders need to know and do and think about in this space. And really, two of the top ones here from major companies with fabulous experience and who have healthy, beautiful humility as well. So thank you. Yes. No, we're really excited to speak with you both, and I appreciate you taking time for us on this conversation. The interesting thing, why I thought it would be fun even to get these two together in particular, is that Doug comes from a perspective of big pharma, healthcare industry sector, and Michael has been working in the entertainment media sector for many, many years. And so deepfakes are a problem rocking all industries. And in particular, I thought these were two important ones to highlight for our conversation. So thank you again. So Doug, from healthcare, Michael in media, what are you seeing as the most relevant deepfake threats that we have to worry about today?
Well, in media, it comes in a whole lot of different flavors. So just from a big industry perspective, you're starting to see a situation where consumers, average members of the public, are concerned about whether what they're seeing is real. And so that affects politics, it affects the way people interact with our companies, it affects the way people interact with businesses. And in media, we feel that we're part of the solution to that problem, but we're in the middle of it, right? So if you see something in one of our magazines or newspapers, the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, you should have a very high degree of appreciation for the fact that what's there is real and that real reporters have investigated it. They're not just posting a picture they found on the internet. But that also imposes on us a lot of responsibilities to maintain the integrity of those brands. And so our reporters don't just rely on a photograph that they see somewhere. We're now using software that helps identify things that are manipulated as artificial intelligence. We do a lot of training to make sure of that. We are also engaged in policy debates about how to ensure that fakery and AI-generated images are not stealing our content, passing themselves off as our brands. We even had a situation last week where somebody emailed us saying that one of the chatbots had quoted us accusing her of being convicted of murder. And when we went back to our site, there was no such thing. There was somebody else with a different last name, with the same last name, I'm sorry, but a different first name, who had been convicted of murder, but an AI chatbot had changed it. And again, kind of creating this problem about brand equity and assurance that what we do is perceived as a reliable source for truth.
So, you know, I think we make pills, right, or serums or vaccines that we want you to put in your body. So the level of trust notion is very much something we share in common. The moment the public becomes concerned about the safety or efficacy or any of the core principles of any of our products, that can become a problem. And any hesitancy even around that we're maybe able to clear up by jumping in quickly and trying to make sure that people have the right facts can be incredibly damaging to, you know, put aside business, to patients. People might not take a vaccine. People might not take their medicine. They might worry that there's a problem that they read about or heard about, and they're not really sure what to do about it. And if you're already in the category of, I'd really rather not spend the money on that medication anyway, or I'm worried about, this side effect or that side effect. It might give you the excuse that you've been looking for. So similarly, we're extremely diligent about making sure we understand and have ways of monitoring what people say, not just about our products, but about all medicines, and at what point are there fakes going on. We worry that somebody is going to take the likeness of our CEO or our chief scientific officer and try to take advantage of that. So those are the key concepts that we're most worried about.
Michael, you shared with us a video this morning regarding a digital human, and it was maybe equal parts fascinating and terrifying because it looked so real, and I could see how many wonderful ways deepfake technology can really help us, but in terms of education and training and simulations and even telehealth communications, as well as the entertainment world, but also how much that could be used for fraud and deception. And talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, a specific example, there was a company called Metaphysic that a friend of mine was an investor in. Metaphysic did super high quality, what you might call a deep fake, but for good. And if you go on you can find, if you search on Metaphysic in America's Got Talent, you can see how they competed and won in America's Got Talent with deep fakes. And they took the judges and put their faces on singers and made it entertainment. It's interesting because when we talk about deepfakes, we talk about the threats, and the threats are real. That's part of what this is about. But they're also create possibilities that all new technologies create, or most new technologies create, that to do incredible things. So this particular business was bought by Google, and now Google's trying to enable people to use the technology to create digital humans that go off and do interesting things in a way that's highly verifiable. So it's very important that you be able to trace it back, that it came from the correct place, that you know that it's real. In the example they used on that, the CEO of the business making the announcement about the new technologies used the technology to create an image of himself. And you can imagine images going out and answering questions as chatbots and other sorts of things that look phenomenally real. So I think there are real use cases. This technology is being used in motion pictures to reduce the cost of making motion pictures. One of the reasons why the movie studios in the beginning were less concerned about AI threats of taking their intellectual property, they were also looking at the benefits of replacing some of their high costs with AI-enabled technology. So many businesses are balancing the two things and trying to figure out how to distinguish between those that are problematic and those that are working positive things.
And Doug, when we were chatting last week, you shared a family story about deepfake tests and training. Can you share that with us, please?
I have 3 kids, 29, 27, and 25, girl, boy, and the middle daughter is, deep into the world of marketing and whatnot. And I was on vacation last week, and my mom, who is almost 90 now, and fortunately doing well, seems to be doing a lot better than people half her age, myself included. I guess I'm not quite half her age, but she was there with us as well. My daughter gave us a quick test on deepfakes. She played a bunch of videos on the TV, and we were all supposed to write down which ones we thought were fake and which ones we thought were real. And my 89-year-old mother won the contest because she's become alert to this notion. People in her church have talked about it. People at community events that she's attended have shown each other videos, and then somebody started out believing whatever it was, and then they looked into it and found it to be fake. And it's the one piece that Judi and I were talking about before. I was talking to my team over the weekend in preparation for this, just getting caught up on some things. There is an element of kind of the silver lining of this is that it's so good that it's getting a lot of people's attention. Judi pointed out, probably not nearly to the level it needs to be, just yet. But if it's getting my mom, who was never particularly tech savvy, interested enough to check it out and try to figure it out, I took that as some sign of hope in the dark chasm that we're looking down into. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So you both provide silver linings in terms of the good parts of things, both in terms of how it can enhance the industry and also is finally getting awareness on something that really we have been talking about for many years. But I also appreciate the point that it is a multi-generational issue and multi-generational problem. I mean, we're seeing very young people victimized in schools through the malicious use of abusive images, elderly people through elder fraud and romance scams, and everyone in between. So I think it is something to think about personally as well as professionally. And then with the types of new technology, like on America's Got Talent, what do we think about as a society in terms of responsible use that balances the benefits with the desire for human-created art and entertainment, as well as avoiding fraud. On the topic of fraud, do we think, is this just, another new version of a clever scheme, or is this a fundamental change in how we think about fraud?
I guess from my perspective, it is a fundamental change. It's kind of both, because there is the level of sophistication that all of this kind of brings to everything. The notion that it's new and different. We were dealing with fake emails for a long time, but the idea that at PFIZER, for example, we had a situation where an outside party created a recording that he then played and left as a voicemail, sounding exactly like our CEO, exactly like the CEO, and who's got a distinctive voice and a Greek accent and everything, basically telling him, look, something has occurred. I need you guys to wire money quickly. Now, fortunately, the person was like, this has never happened before. It seems really weird. They applied common sense judgment, and they didn't do what the hacker was hoping they would do. That's going to improve if it hasn't already very, very quickly. And if it isn't, my elderly mom or me getting scammed by it, we know there are situations where businesses have fallen for these kinds of dynamics, and it's serious, and it doesn't seem like regulation is anywhere near keeping up with it.
Yeah, I mean, we've added to our controls the requirement that things like that all result in a callback to a known number. So people are prepared for those things. I have seen in my years people get to people who didn't exercise common sense. And so we had problems to recover from. But we are trying to constantly train on this, and it becomes part of our cybersecurity training as well as similar sort of thing as you look for phishing scams and other kinds of things that are enticing people to click where they shouldn't click. So it's a continuum on the same scale. From a regulatory point of view, I agree with Doug, not much seems to be happening. The EU now has a voluntary code that I think goes into place this August about requiring people to mark things that are created by AI. Transparency would go a long way towards solving these problems, but of course the crooks are not going to be transparent about it. I do think that there's a role for intermediaries to play. There are ways to detect AI-created content, and when it's not marked, it ought to be blocked before it does more damage. Right now, the intermediaries are running away from anything that could be termed a responsibility in those regards. But I think I don't see, just like with IP, I don't see how there's a solution that doesn't include some of the companies that are involved in passing that information along.
How about from a leadership perspective? We do at the Center for Cybersecurity a lot of board-related education and training. I sit on a public company board, and I know you both are very engaged with your boards of directors. Whether at your own enterprises or more generally or hypothetically, do we think that deepfakes are getting enough attention at the board level and the right kind of attention?
Right, well, there are a couple of different levels to that. One is the issue we were just talking about, you know, it's really a cybersecurity kind of issue. And that's within our risk framework, and our risk managers are always kind of tightening up the requirements and the controls, and they report back to our board on a regular basis about what they're doing in each one of those regards. Now, that's not to say every board knows every nuance of all of this, but they are responsible for ensuring that the people who are charged with that are doing their jobs correctly and that they are qualified to do them. And so we do bring them back, and we do audit kind of the way we do that. With respect to the big societal questions about media and the role of information, it's a topic that gets talked about quite a lot on the media company boards. And so, you know, we're very actively engaged in a number of the policy debates right now, both specifically deepfake kinds of issues, or really AI-generated content kinds of issues, but we're also really focused on the economics of media, right? So one of the things that happens is that our content gets scraped and pulled up from our own sites, from pirate sites, and then used and monetized. And that undermines the economics that allow branded, careful, human-curated content to exist. And so that particular policy debate is something that our board is focused on, and we're using all the tools we can to make sure whatever comes out of the policy debates that are so active right now appropriately reflects the importance of that.
It's really interesting to me, especially to kind of listen to, you know, Michael in this regard. I always find listening to Michael interesting, but it feels to me, I'm reflecting while he's talking, like the media piece is more experienced at this than we are in the pharmaceutical space, because maybe understandably a lot of the deepfakes that happen impact their industry more. And I guess it makes me a little nervous that it's gonna take like a big nasty problem to get, you know, each industry, you've got to experience it in your industry before you get past the, okay, well, you know, nothing really bad has happened just yet, because we do the same kind of things. We do all the risk assessments. We have good conversations with our board about cybersecurity, including deepfakes. You know, we're training on it and picking up on it. But I guess, to be candid, I worry that industries that haven't yet gotten whacked by a difficult problem, right? It's the old, you learn a lot more after you have your first fall on your bicycle than you do before that. And you're a little bit more careful after you get back up, you know, which is frustrating because, you know, we should know better. But I'm a little nervous that there's an element of that.
That's a really great point, because so the Center for Cybersecurity at NYU was founded 10 years ago. This is our anniversary year. And Women Leaders in Cybersecurity also is in its 10th anniversary year. And 10 years ago on cybersecurity, we said what you just said, Doug. We said, you know, the companies that got hit by cyber attacks are the ones who have woken up and gotten better and ahead of cybersecurity. And the industries where we were seeing attacks, initially the financial services sector, were taking a lead on it. And now here we are about deepfakes, and that I do agree, that seems true. So how do we learn from the long path of cybersecurity that we haven't fully figured out yet to make things better from a management perspective in addressing deepfake risk?
You know, I do think that concept of let's not wait until we're the ones that get clobbered is always on the minds of management teams, and, you know, at big companies and smaller companies too, and certainly on the minds of board members. Cybersecurity is a huge deal for us, and something that's of significant concern to our board. We really talk about it extensively. I hold some hope in the notion that we can really embed this under the category of cybersecurity, and just make sure. You know, I don't want to be the one, right? You don't want to be the one that gets really clobbered by it. I take comfort in the fact that I think there are things that we're doing to kind of manage it, but I just worry that, I haven't seen, maybe I've missed it, in the pharmaceutical or healthcare space, a big, moment like the $25 million CEO scam that happened, or something like that makes people go, whoa, our friends over at fill in the blank large pharmaceutical company just had this happen. That always generates the, where are we on that? And what if that happened here? Would we be better off or worse off?
Yeah, and you'll remember it has to be 10 or 12 years ago when I was at VIACOM and it was time for me to get really interested in this, and we worked together at NYU. We instituted a separation where cybersecurity was always just part of the chief technology officer's purview or the chief information officer's purview. And we segregated oversight of cybersecurity because the head of technology would come in and talk to the board, and he'd list 27 software packages that were implemented, and nobody would have any idea what he was talking about, or any idea whether it was complete, or any idea about what he was not spending money on so he could spend money on some functionality that was also important. So we implemented a cybersecurity audit process that was separate, and we used an outside consultant and our risk team to do that. And now good risk teams have all built that kind of oversight function so that the person who's deciding how much money to spend on cybersecurity and making those allocations is not the one who's checking to see whether the cybersecurity is correct. But we started down that road, and then Sony got hacked. And so in our industry, that was the CEOs lost their jobs. Very important talent relationships were totally disrupted when they decided to release a movie about North Korea in which, Kim Jong-un, I think, was killed at the end. And the North Koreans didn't think it was very funny and decided to completely shut them down and then release all of the contents of their email. And so, those kinds of events really do get people's attention. People thought what I was doing was interesting, and then when that happened, all of a sudden, my CEO cared about it a ton.
So if the board asks you or someone, what are we doing about deepfake risk? What would be a good answer for active engagement in the next 90 days?
I'm going to let you answer that first.
And if you want to change that 90-day to a medium and longer term time frame, feel free.
Well, in the area of controls, I would ask questions about how your company is addressing that risk. So there needs to be training, there needs to be looking at tools, because there are tools that detect deep fakes. There needs to be looking at, when you think about controls, if people are sending out checks based on an email or a voice message, what is the secondary way to ensure that what's coming in is valid and authorized? And everybody who touches things like that or other areas of critical importance are trained on this. We've been doing this in cybersecurity for a long time. Probably all of you get emails once in a while that have a deliberately fake link in them that you click on and you get chastised by your technology group, and sometimes you have to sit for some more training. These kinds of things need to be upgraded, continually evaluated and improved for what the latest threats are, and certainly deepfakes are an important part of that.
Yeah, and then at the next level, the conversation with the board is, how are we doing in that regard? How many incidents did we have, et cetera? Hopefully, at least we start out, I'm sure you guys hear the same kind of stats. Every time we talk about cybersecurity, it's, tens of millions of attacks happen every single day. So now this is all way beyond your ability to even kind of really comprehend what the real numbers are. Collecting and figuring out how many deepfake-like situations do we have, what do they look like, what do they sound like, what do people do in response, did we fall for it, did we catch it, how does the training have to be updated, so that we can kind of keep measuring ourselves, and the board has something to look at to give it the level of comfort that it should have.
Great points. And I do think it's important, first of all, that the board is talking about it and that the senior leadership team is talking about it, because we do see that executives and board members are often targeted because they can have influence and make people do things very quickly if they think that it's a time-sensitive
Their
matter.
image is out there and their voice is out there, and yep.
Exactly, exactly. So I do think on the awareness piece, it's really important. And then it does depend to some degree on the industry, to the extent that you can bring to the board industry examples of different ways that the fraud is occurring, and also the size and maturity level of the company. So some companies are doing more with deepfakes by relying on other, and cybersecurity, but AI generally, on relying on what their third parties are doing to help detect it and what solutions they can add to their suite of tools, whereas others may have more internal processes and procedures. So I do think it depends, but it's a really important conversation to have.
Yeah, one thing we figured out is that we're busy rolling out AI tools, as many of you are, right? So now we have chatbots and other sorts of things, and we're trying to make sure our employees are facile with them and begin to learn what the tools are that can help make their work more productive. In doing that, some of the controls that we use are about where did the email come from when it goes to the CFO who says to send the check. The AI bot may be in your company. It may not be outside your company, and it may be falsely instructed by somebody, but it could be an employee. And so that changes some of the controls, and it needs to be thought through.
And it really does highlight, it's technological concerns, but obviously, as you've been mentioning, governance solutions and protocols are really necessary as well, and leadership on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
So with regard to deepfakes, Michael, you mentioned about regulation. Do you both think that we need more regulation or some different regulation? Do what we have good enough?
Well, as I talked about, the Europeans are trying hard to require AI to identify itself. And there are some protocols that have been developed with watermarks that are reasonably robust, so that if they were detected that they had been modified, you would know. Now, somebody on the receiving end has to decide they care, and that's actually a role where intermediaries can take place. But I do think that it's the early days. I think Congress tried to pass a moratorium on state regulation of AI. That would have been disastrous because there was no federal regulation. So much easier to defeat things than it is to make things happen. So a lot's happening at the states. And I think the states are grappling with these kinds of issues, everything from, pornography that's created, with the faces of real people, to all these other kinds of things, and trying to allocate and sort out who can technically be responsible, who ought to be responsible for ensuring that what people receive is not unauthenticated AI.
Again, in the area of silver linings, we have a lot more hope on intermediaries and other third parties in the supply chain space, in the areas where we interact with physicians and healthcare providers and hospitals, to make sure that any space where any kind of AI generated fake or fraud could be detected, because there's a lot more interest. Those people know the systems better. They have a lot more motivation to figure out solutions more quickly, and industry can then connect and work better, hopefully in an efficient way to get there. We'll get regulation, same thing, after some really bad thing happens that gets everybody really, really outraged, and then drives, the political dynamic to react.
One of the benefits is, at least, that it's been recognized that deepfake threats are a bipartisan issue. And we have had some bipartisan regulation in the area with regard to abusive images, which is a positive step, I'd say. And I do hope that there is meaningful progress in terms of thoughtful regulation, so we don't get a knee-jerk response that then questions, it unduly hinders creativity or First Amendment rights. And we are in this tricky land of protecting the truth without censorship of the other areas that may be satire or art. And how do we thread that or walk that line is really important.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who are legitimately asking the question about whether copyright itself is obsolete, right? Because copyright was built for a day of careful, nuanced judgments decided by courts. And these are decisions that are being made in milliseconds by computer systems that don't have time or the ability to make those kinds of judgments. And so there are a lot of policy decisions that have to get made, and even fair use, which, you know, different people have a lot of different views about what it means. But the Copyright Act threw fair use really to the courts to make policy. It talks about whether it has an unreasonable effect on the marketplace. It talks about the nature of the use, a whole bunch of things like that. What we really need are rules that are capable of being implemented in a system that operates at the speed that our internet operates at. And so that kind of a system doesn't exist. And so we need to be able to make these decisions. You talked about in Germany, for example, there's a law that holds people responsible for passing along fake information. Now, in the news media, in some ways that helps us, right? We're careful about those things. On the other hand, it's a tool. Right now, we operate under a scheme where we have to not be malicious in publishing information. That's not nearly strict liability. News media make mistakes all the time. But if we're reasonably careful about what we do, we're not going to have liability under a libel scheme. Under rules like that, it could begin to move towards a strict liability scheme, which would be dangerous for the First Amendment.
And when you add to it the layer of my son over the weekend's using, one of the apps that helps you build an app. And at the end, he wanted to ultimately get the code, and the app was coming back saying, I can't give you the code. So he literally just told the app to make it part of the app to put the code and have it accessible with a copy button. And the app did it. And that generation is gonna figure that out pretty quickly. And that's his first day interacting with an app like that. So the more people realize that they can also use AI to circumvent the things that we're doing to try to manage the AI, the more challenging it's going to continue to get.
Great point.
He needs a job, by the way, so if anybody...
Well, he sounds very clever, I will say.
Go.
So we have just a minute and a half left. What would you say is the biggest mistake organizations are making on deepfakes, if you haven't?
I'll go back to my, I hope we're not waiting for another company in the industry to experience a big problem in the space so that we can kind of put a face on it and name the problem, and people feel like it's a little bit more likely to happen. You're always dealing with limited resources. So if you're gonna say, as the chief legal officer of a company, I'm worried about this, and I think we need to take it more seriously, and I'm concerned about it, it's going to be like, okay, well, then what are we not doing so that we can start doing that? And, the competition for those resources is real and significant. So hopefully we're not waiting too long.
And I also think you should just be, like in the early days of cybersecurity, and we do it now every so often, we have what we call a tabletop, which is how do you pull all the senior leaders of your company together around a crisis in this space? What's the Jonathan Swift comment about falsehoods fly and the truth comes limping after it? You can do a lot of damage in the public domain, in particular, with something that turns out not to be true. And having a plan for how you're going to deal with that, I think, is an area that requires a great deal of senior leadership time.
Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate your wisdom.